Hello, my fellow Extraordinary Americans. I'm Samaddar, and this is Extraordinary America. What is Extraordinary America about? You see, American identity is about freedom, the opportunity for a better life, and the pursuit of happiness. Welcome to Extraordinary America. Sherry is an extraordinary individual, and I'm glad and honored to have her on the show. Sherry, are you there?
I'm here. Thanks for having me, Cosmos, and thanks for that lovely introduction.
Thank you so much, Sherry, for taking the time to do this podcast with me. So, Sherry, could you tell me and the audience a little bit more about yourself, your background, and how you got started?
Sure. So I grew up in Toronto, Canada. I am the daughter of immigrants. My dad is from Pakistan. My mom is from Tanzania. And that upbringing, like being the daughter of immigrants in a place like Canada, had a huge effect, I think, on my ethos and my mission in life. I became aware from a very early age how lucky I was to have grown up in Canada, because I thought about what it would have been like growing up in either where my parents were from. And that led me to want to dedicate my time to being of service and helping others. So I pursued a career in international development, like you read. From my bio, I ended up consulting to the UN and the World Bank for 10 years. And in that work, I was really focused on poverty reduction. So I worked with countries to design programs to help them reduce poverty. And for those 10 years, I was very nomadic. So most people would do that work based out of New York or DC. And perhaps they would go to like mission for a few weeks a year. I decided to be fully abroad. I would come home for maybe 10 days a year, but about 355 days a year, I would be all over the world.
Wow.
And mostly in resource constrained environments. So mostly Africa and then parts of South America and Asia. And uh, in that time, sorry to give you like a long, story. Um,
No, we're
I
all for it. Go ahead.
I saw that if my goal was to reduce poverty, I saw that you can't fully address poverty without addressing mental health. Like the two go hand in hand. So I began to look for solutions to address the mental health crisis because I was witnessing it firsthand. And I saw that most of the ways we're treating mental health don't really work. And throughout this show, if it makes sense, I can go through what I mean, but just really broken system where we're masking symptoms and not addressing the root cause of our trauma. And I then stumbled upon the data around psychedelic therapy, which again, I'm happy to share more about, but was blown away to see like really the opposite effect compared to traditional methods to treat mental health. These medicines, psychedelic medicines, seem to be extremely effective with very little side effects. And the more I read about it, the more I'm very data driven. So the more data I saw, the more intrigued I was. And ultimately, after seeing for sure like how transformative these medicines are, I decided to leave my very fulfilling, high paying, rewarding career in international development and become an entrepreneur and start a psychedelic company. So that's in a nutshell my story.
Wow, Sherry. So just to elaborate on this, right? Like, what was your strategic vision from the time you were in the UN working on these poverty reduction programs to the point where you decided that this is what you wanted to do, and like how did the connection between poverty and health help bring that about? Because for the sake of the audience, like it's a interesting connection how mental health affects poverty. So, what was your strategic vision that led to the moment that you founded your company, Enthea?
I am not sure. I would say I might regret saying it, that I've said this later, but I'm not sure if there was so much strategic vision as there was always following a combination of like intuition and purpose. So I'm very intentional with everything that I do. I may not be strategic or have always the most long-term vision, but with everything I do, I try to live, with my purpose spiritually would be to know God, and in life would be to serve others. And at the micro level, like every action comes with those kinds of intentions. And so in my work in poverty reduction, it wasn't like a long strategic vision. It was more so I knew that I wanted to help others in countries that have, less privilege, less resources available. So I pursued that career at the UN and the World Bank. When I was doing that work, I knew I intentionally wanted to be in some of the most difficult countries. I intentionally said, like, I don't need to be home. I don't need to be with friends and families, even like during my 20s, like the fun years. I want to be able to be of service. So that was very intentional. And then when I started seeing the overlap, like the projects that I was working on should have, in theory, gotten people out of poverty because we were giving people money every month, sort of like welfare or like universal basic income. And sometimes that money we were giving them, it wasn't a loan. So not sometimes, it was never a loan. Nobody had to pay it back. And sometimes it was combined with like education benefits, basic healthcare benefits, access to, some infrastructure, help getting a job, these kinds of things. And in theory, if you're giving people money every month and you're maybe also giving them some food supplements and some education, access to education and access to healthcare, after 2 years, they shouldn't be in poverty, like just by definition, right?
Yeah.
And yet, you would see, depending on the country, something like 50% of people, 60% of people, 40 to 60% of people still in poverty. And although I didn't do like a rigorous clinical trial, it didn't take long for me to make the connection. Well, 40 to 60% of people in these countries are suffering from a severe mental health issue. And we're not doing anything to address that. And you'll see the same, you know, again, I'm talking a lot, but like if you in America look at our homeless population, right? The prevalence of mental health conditions amongst the homeless is way higher than amongst other populations. So seeing that connection, again, going back to like, I'm not sure it was strategic vision. I'm just like, okay, I need to solve this problem. I'm trying to reduce poverty. These people are not getting helped with money. They have mental health issues. We're not addressing them. How do we address them? It's, just this kind of iterative process of problem solving. Well, you read studies on antidepressants. They work well for 15% of the people that take them. 58% of the people that take them have moderate to severe side effects. Most people drop their antidepressants. Half of them drop it within 2 months because of those side effects. You look at something like talk therapy. First of all, very hard to implement in a resource-constrained environment. Like imagine the kinds of countries I'm working in, very hard to implement like regular talk therapy. Even in America, we have access issues, but it works well for 50% of people that do it after 15 to 20 sessions. So that's also not like a very scalable solution. Most people won't be able to afford or have the patience for 20 therapy sessions, right? And so I just kept looking, like I just kept thinking there has to be some sort of answer. Like look at all of the other ways we've advanced and in science and technology. The fact that we're on this Zoom right now.
Yeah.
And I really just stumbled upon all of this evidence that has been there for decades and also millennia because in many civilizations people have been using psychedelics spiritually for healing for thousands of years, but in the science realm we've been studying it since the 60s or 50s. I stumbled upon all of this and it was like, okay, here's a solution. Why aren't we offering this? And then again, I go down the rabbit hole of like, well, this is what happened. Drugs got regulated. They become scheduled substances. There was a war on drugs. Okay, now the policies are a little bit lifting. The FDA has given some of these substances breakthrough status, which means they're prioritizing their approval. okay, what can we do to get more people access to this? Because all of the science tells us it's effective.
Mhm.
Now we just have the problem of access. I don't know if that really helps. I'm basically walking you through the
No,
in my
it,
mind.
it,
It's
it does.
intentional, it's intentional every step of the way, but it's not so much strategic. It's really just like I'm always thinking how to help as many people as possible, how to be of service, how to reduce suffering. So even, a year from now, not to say that I would abandon my company because it's very much like my baby, but a couple of years from now, if I can't even imagine it right now, but if something else comes to me where there's an opportunity to help even more people, I may pursue that road because that's my compass.
Sherry, what you just what you shared with us is so fascinating and interesting because you worked at the UN and with the World Bank and you helped with these poverty reducing programs. And then you stumbled across this thing that even though you can give a lot of people universal basic income or free money, they're still going to be in poverty because it's connected to mindset and mental health. But what is interesting, Sherry, is that you found out that psychedelics, it can be a potential medicine to like help combat mental trauma, which I find very fascinating because I also had been looking into it because but here's the issue, right? The problem with the psychedelics is the negative connotations because it is associated because of Richard Nixon in the 1970s. They basically put it under the classification of drugs. So whenever people hear that, they're like, "Oh, is that a drug?" And then when they think of that, they're putting it into the same level as meth or cocaine or something. So, for the sake of the audience, can you elaborate the differences between psychedelics as a form of mental therapy versus the other drugs that people think about when they hear the word drug?
Yes, I can. And just for the record, I still believe in universal basic income and think it's a great tool. I really believe in it and think every country should adopt it if it was possible. But giving money to people does help. It just won't help everyone. Okay, now to answer your question about the context about drugs, drugs and psychedelics and this sort of stigma, you're absolutely right. During the Nixon era, there was the whole war on drugs, and psychedelics became reclassified. They became scheduled substances, just like cocaine and meth. And there are very big differences. For one, from a toxicity scale, psychedelics are non-toxic, meaning you can't overdose from traditional psychedelics. So you hear about someone having, a very long trip on a psychedelic, but you won't hear about someone overdosing from mushrooms, for example. So they're non-toxic and they're also non-habit forming. So we don't get chemically addicted to traditional psychedelics. And these two things, the fact that they're non-toxic and non-habit forming, make them in a league of their own compared to things like sugar, caffeine, cocaine, nicotine. Like all of those things are very habit forming, very addictive substances. The other thing about traditional psychedelics is the receptor that they work on in the brain. They work on the 5-HT2A, which is a serotonin receptor in the brain, not to get too sciencey. The way antidepressants work is they basically increase the serotonin in our brain. The way psychedelics work is they work on that serotonin receptor so that our brain produces more serotonin. Does that make sense? Which is, this thing in our brain that's responsible for feeling happy. And then, coming from a less scientific and more linguistic perspective, the word psychedelic means mind manifesting. So it's a very different experience to other drugs where you are in this altered state that allows you to, reflect, dissociate, have a very spiritual experience, and reduce activity in your default mode network in the brain. So we've now seen with going back to science, we've now seen with science that psychedelics are really special because there's this area in our brain that, especially with people with a lot of anxiety and depression, is way too active. It's called the
Mhm.
default. It's super active all the time. We all have it. And it's active in all of us. Like when I'm going for a walk and I'm reflecting, my default mode network is active. That's good. I should be reflecting. But if you have too much anxiety and depression, it's too active all the time, and you tend to ruminate, tend to focus on negative thought patterns. And psychedelics are really beautiful because, unlike other drugs, they allow for that activity to go down, and they allow for neuroplasticity. So you can have more connections form in the brain. You can have a reset, and you can form new positive thought patterns that, if done correctly, will lead to lasting change. So yes, there's a whole lot of stigma where, there is this commercial where like the egg was in the frying pan, and it's like, this is your brain on drugs. It's like, but
Yeah.
that's really not the case when it comes to psychedelics. If anything, it's the opposite, because for most people, even people without a mental health issue, there's evidence to show that it leads to creativity and optimization and closer connection to loved ones and to nature. So it really is this beautiful resetting of your brain rather than frying an egg.
I mean, Sherry, like there's been like so many studies conducted, right? Like people that go to these ayahuasca ceremonies or peyote ceremonies, right? Like where they have like a shaman and then they go through the ceremony and they drink this liquid psychedelic, right? And they go through these altered states of consciousness and they basically have something with from which what I've heard something called ego death, where they lose their individual identity and they feel this oneness and connection with everything. And a lot of people, it has been said that have reported that it transformed their lives completely. Like they got a spiritual purpose. Like before, they were very selfish and materialistic, and now they became more kinder and compassionate as a result of those life-altering experiences. But I don't know, like what's your perspective on these things and how they influence you in the long term?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. I forget the exact statistic, but I forget the exact, sorry, can you give me 1 second? I apologize.
Yeah.
My apologies. I forget the exact statistic, but it's a greater than 50% number that people that participated in psychedelic trials and did psychedelic therapy even decades ago, they end up rating it in their top three life experiences. And this is like, again, forgetting the statistic, but it's greater than 50%. They literally put it up there with getting married, having a kid. So
Wow.
it is this
That
really
is incredible.
It's this really huge transformative experience. And in fact, because of the studies that were done on psychedelics and are still being done, they had to come up with a whole new survey for mystical experiences. So when we do, when in academia, when people do studies, they have like maybe a scale for depression or a scale for anxiety to measure, like, how much depression does someone have, how much anxiety does someone have. But they actually had to come up with something to measure a mystical experience, which never was needed before. But it's because these psychedelics lead to these beautiful, hard to explain mystical experiences. And you are absolutely correct. People walk away uh, feeling transformed, feeling this ego death, feeling connected to nature. Often people will say, even though this wasn't like their intention, it's not like they were suffering from, it does help with addiction, but even sometimes when this is not their intention, people will walk away from a psychedelic experience. They'll never drink alcohol again, or they'll never have junk food again, and that's not even like what the problem they were trying to treat. It's just sort of like an outcome of like they feel, reset. There's one study that showed, this one was for treating addiction for smoking cessation, that showed 80% of people that participated in the psilocybin trial, which is the magic mushrooms, the ingredient in magic mushrooms. And these people were, avid smokers. A year later, 80% of them were no longer smoking. I mean, that's more
Wow.
effective than anything else that we have for smoking cessation, which takes many lives and leads to so many health problems. So yeah, it's a really hard to explain if you haven't experienced transformative, beautiful experience. Even there's some smaller studies that show people with people in conflict. So I know right now they're trying to do a study in Israel with Israeli and Palestinian people to see if it'll like help bridge, divides. That study hasn't been done yet, but it's underway. But there's been other studies in similar situations of people with conflict, like police officers, and like the people that perhaps committed a crime, to sort of like bring people together in this way.
Wow. I mean, it's fascinating, right? It's like a really big subject. But like next question I wanted to ask Sherry is about its connection with regards to mental health. So, in America, a lot of people suffer from mental health, depression, anxiety, right? And the number one thing they use to combat that is using antidepressant drugs. But we also know that psychedelic therapy is a very powerful way and a natural way to also heal as well. So, from your perspective, how does psychedelic treatment compare with the antidepressant drugs given off by like the pharmacy industry?
So psychedelics are 4 times more effective than antidepressants, at least. We can look at, it depends, there are different psychedelics. So let's just be clear. We have traditional psychedelics, which are known, like I said, to work on the 5-HT2A receptor. So that includes psilocybin, so magic mushrooms, MDMA, also commonly known as Molly or ecstasy, and like LSD, commonly known as acid. So those are like traditional psychedelics. There are many other psychedelics, peyote and mescaline and ayahuasca. We won't be able to,
DMT.
pardon?
DMT.
Exactly. And then there's ketamine, which there's different opinions on, does it count as a psychedelic or not. I would say if the definition of a psychedelic is mind manifesting, then ketamine is a psychedelic. And I mean, in that case, like even, breath work can be psychedelic because of the mind manifesting effect, right? But ketamine works on a different receptor in the brain called the NMDA receptor. So it's a little bit different mechanism of action, but a similar effect. And how it compares, you said, going back to your original question of comparing it to antidepressants. Well, one, it only requires a few administrations. So antidepressants, people are often on for years, if not decades. Some people I know are on it, yes, for decades, literally since their teenage years. And people play with dosages and brands, but they're, on this antidepressant and that antidepressant. And then, like I said, 58% of people have moderate to severe side effects from antidepressants. So often you'll take your antidepressant and then you have to take something else to help you sleep because it gave you insomnia, or it does something to your appetite, so you have to take other pills. Psychedelics is not like this. Few administrations. Depending on the psychedelic and your situation, it would be 1 to 6 sessions. Actually, 1 to 4 with most psychedelics, and ketamine 1 to 6 sessions on average. So it's not something you keep taking for the rest of your life. It's not something you take daily. It's literally something you do a few times and it leads to lasting change. I think 33% of people have a greater than 50% reduction in symptoms with antidepressants. And that number is like 70% with ketamine-assisted therapy. So there's like a really huge difference there. 89% of people actually show improvement in their mental health from ketamine-assisted therapy. And what's really interesting about psychedelic therapy is at 1 year follow-up, depends on the psychedelic, the number I'm going to say, but greater than 50% will no longer show signs of whatever their original diagnosis was, whether it's PTSD or depression or anxiety. They'll no longer have that anymore 1 year later. Over 50% of people that do psychedelic therapy. So it's really a game changer, and to me, like, is on a whole other level than antidepressants.
Yeah, it is true. Like there's been a lot of like especially like early when I was mentioning about the ceremonies, like it has been much more effective than a lot of these antidepressants. But unfortunately, like in today's world, everything is run by money, and the pharmaceutical industry wants to make a huge amount of profits. So it'll be against their interest to have such a thing become expanded. But it all comes down to like profits in today's world, you know?
Unfortunately, that is the case, and we see that even with ketamine. So, um, just for people who don't know, all of these psychedelics, the traditional ones, they're not FDA approved yet. So LSD, psilocybin, MDMA, they all have breakthrough status from the FDA, which means that they've shown great outcomes and they're being fast tracked for approval. The review of MDMA is happening in June, and there's supposed to be an announcement about its approval in August of this year. So we're very close. Fingers crossed it's a yes. But ketamine is actually available. It's an FDA approved medicine as an anesthetic. And to your point about big pharma, generic ketamine, which is highly effective, is very cheap. It's about $5 a dose. And so, of course, big pharma came and made a branded version of ketamine, which costs $600 to $900 a dose, which
Wow.
which you
Oh,
have to actually keep doing every week on top of your antidepressants versus like the generic ketamine. The protocol is go off of your antidepressants, do ketamine therapy, and do it 1 to 6 times. And most people will no longer be on antidepressants later. But this branded version of ketamine called S-ketamine or Spravato, no, you stay on your antidepressants. You're now just adding another medicine to take, and you do it every week.
so Sherry, one question I have to ask, right? So, in connection to this, so you've been in these poverty reduction programs, but then at some point you found out that mental health has a connection to mental health has a big connection to that. Could you elaborate a little more about how you found out that mental health is important to having economic prosperity?
Yeah, I'm going to elaborate on that, and also sort of there's another jump, which I think for the audience, I didn't really share. It was like I was doing poverty reduction, and now I have a company that sells employee benefit plans in America, which is, even for me, a big jump and has been a humbling like part of my journey. I was very focused on like I need to. I even said in my story, like I'm the daughter of immigrants. I felt very privileged growing up in Canada. Like I need to, go to the world and help all of these other people all over the world. And I neglected how much like mental health is affecting people back home, back here in North America. Like it doesn't discriminate. And it was very wrong of me to think like this is just a third world problem, to put it in like very explicit terms, and not a first world problem. I don't like using those terms, but it's trying to like exaggerate my point. And so what happened in that jump is I started pitching to these different international organizations that we should be looking at psychedelic therapy in places of conflict, places post-war, in refugee camps. Like there's so much trauma, we should be looking at psychedelic therapy here. And one of my mentors said, Sherry, like these are great ideas that you have, but you don't have one place in the world where people are getting psychedelic therapy at scale. You only have clinical trials, great clinical trials from top tier universities like Johns Hopkins, right?
Mhm.
Don't have anywhere where people are doing this at scale. So how can you possibly try to propose that we do this in, a refugee camp if we don't have any model to go off of? And so that is, what led me to be like, oh, I need to solve for this first. Going back to like the lack of long-term strategic vision, there was a hurdle, and I was like, okay, how do I solve that problem? Is anybody offering psychedelic therapy to people at scale? How do you do that? Oh, you have to do it through like insurance or through benefit plans. Is anyone doing that? No. So that's what kind of like led me to start my company. And then going down that rabbit hole to answer your question, like, some of the links between not just economic prosperity, but like how this affects the workplace. Mental health is the number one reason that Gen Zers and millennials left their job. Untreated mental health costs US employers $3.7 trillion a year.
Wow.
Uh,
That is a lot.
2.7 trillion a year. 60% of our missed work days are due to mental health reasons, like when we call in sick or when, we say like, I'm not coming in today. And then there's also a problem of like, I go to work, but I'm not present. I'm not being productive because, my mental health is suffering. So I'm worried about a loved one who has a mental health issue. So I'm just not focused at work. And so it's sort of like there's all of this data. I could talk to you all day and give you statistics and numbers all day. But if you think about it from a human level, numbers aside, how would you be able to go out every day? And some people might be able to do it, but most people think about it. How can you go out every day and go earn a living, succeed at your job, excel in your career, grow and take care of your family, do all of these responsibilities if you are drowning in a sea of depression? Like if you're literally not able to function because your depression is so strong, or you're questioning whether or not you have a lot of suicidal thoughts, so you're questioning whether or not you even have the will to live, it would make it pretty difficult to go to work every day, right? And unfortunately, this is the reality for millions of people.
Yeah, depression is a very real thing, and a lot of people suffer with it in silence. Like they never really air it out, and they just hold it within. And there has to be like a long-term sustainable solution. And I do think like while comparing it with antidepressants, that psychedelic therapy is a more effective thing. But with regards to uh, all of this, Sherry, what was the greatest revelation and insight you had during your entire span, from going from the World Bank to starting your company and then understanding how mental health and poverty are connected together?
One thing you said, I'll answer your question, but one thing you said that I just wanted to note for the audience, like you said, people are suffering in silence. I actually talk about this often, the silent sufferers,
Mhm.
something we don't even talk about enough, and I think needs to be addressed is um up to 60% of people with mental health conditions are treatment resistant. So those people, up to 60%, actually like no amount of antidepressants or talk therapy is going to work on them. Maybe it'll have mild effects, but it's not going to cure them. And so think about that. Like to me, that's like that it hurts so much to think about, like they must be suffering in silence because they've tried these other methods and these other methods don't work. So they probably feel like so broken, right? And so, anyways, for anyone who's listening right now who that resonates with, and if that does strike a chord, I just want to say, like, please know you're not alone. You don't need to suffer in silence. This is where things like ketamine therapy and psychedelic therapy can help, because it's something that actually does work on treatment-resistant populations. So yeah, wanted to just point that out. And then to answer your question, quite truthfully, I don't think there was like one huge specific moment or insight. It was a culmination of everything I had seen. I worked in like dozens of countries in Africa, Asia, and South America. I saw so much poverty firsthand. I've worked with formerly incarcerated and homeless people and victims of human trafficking. Just like a life of service, I've witnessed a lot. And it was really the culmination of this. Like, I always have been trying to find solutions to get people to stop suffering, and it's like incomplete. It's just something you see, like it's incomplete without addressing mental health. And it's so hard to address mental health because all of the options we have don't really work well. So I wish I had like an aha moment I could tell you, but there isn't a specific one where I can be like, oh yeah, that's when I saw it. It's really just everything I saw combined.
So Sherry, for those that are suffering from mental health and it's also affecting their job and productivity performance, like what is the biggest challenge in your from your perspective that prevents them from actually getting the right help or like the right treatment?
Oh, okay. Uh, there's not one big challenge, there's a few. One, there's still so much stigma. Psychedelics aside, depending on your circle, and maybe in like certain circles in like Silicon Valley or something, it's like now okay to talk about mental health, but in most circles it's very much stigmatized. Forget psychedelics. So one huge challenge is stigma. It's hard to talk about, hard to talk about with our friends, hard to talk about with our family members, hard to talk about with our coworkers. So that's one. Two, access. The most behavioral health therapists, for example, don't take insurance, so you have to pay out of pocket. Sometimes even when you um, do have insurance or do have a therapist that's covered by insurance, there's long wait lists or there isn't one in your area, so you have to drive a long distance. And then so access is like another huge barrier, financially and geographically. And then third is efficacy, right? So I'm like, feel like I'm keep hammering on this point, but like, let's say you get over the stigma part and you're able to like get over, the taboos around this. And then you get over the access part because you have great insurance or you have a therapist nearby or you have enough money to pay out of pocket. So you find this and then it doesn't even work. Like you go to therapy or you get antidepressants and it doesn't work. So we have these challenges of stigma, access, and efficacy. It's really like a recipe for disaster, right?
Mhm.
Um, so for those listening, I'm so sorry if you're in that situation. And do know that there are resources to get access to things like ketamine assisted therapy and psychedelic assisted therapy that if you've tried other things and they haven't worked for you, these treatments are out there.
No, totally. Like anybody that's listening to this, like they should never like first of all, they should never suffer in silence and they should be able to get the right resources. So Sherry, like if somebody that's listening to this is suffering from depression and in silence or they want to get help, like what resources can they look up or like what educational things can they see in order to take the next steps in order to solve their issues?
There isn't like a one size fits all approach. But there's a few resources I can share. And also, if offline people want to find me on LinkedIn and message me or email me with more questions.
I'm going to ask you that anyways towards the end. Yeah.
But I'm always happy to answer questions. One, if you're interested in learning more about psychedelic therapy, I highly recommend the book/Netflix series called How to Change Your Mind. If you like reading, it's a great book by Michael Pollan. If you don't like reading, they've turned it into a Netflix 4-part docuseries, so you can watch that. That's a great introduction to psychedelic therapy. Two, you can probably find there's ketamine assisted therapists available all over the country. You can probably find one in your area. One trick I would say is don't just search ketamine therapy, because then you might find a center that just gives you a ketamine infusion, like in an IV drip, and then sends you home. And all of the data tells us that like doing it in conjunction with therapy is far more effective. So Google ketamine assisted therapy in your city. One great provider that's basically nationwide is called Skylight Psychedelics. They yeah, they're nationwide. And there's no other psychedelics that you can legally do in the US aside from ketamine, except for in Oregon, you can do psilocybin. So you could look up psilocybin facilities in Oregon. But if you do want to try another psychedelic and you don't live in Oregon, some great places are Beckley Retreats, which is in Jamaica. They work with psilocybin. The Beyond Ibogaine Clinic, they're in Mexico. There's clinics everywhere, so I can't list them all, but those two are really great. And there's a website called retreatguru.com, which finds all of these sort of retreat centers all over the world and puts them in a comprehensive place. And then finally, there's a website called journeyom.com, which helps you find the right psychedelic facilitator, be it in the US or abroad. So that's a lot of information, but I didn't even mention my company. I just
I'm gonna
mentioned.
ask. I'll ask you that in a little bit, so don't worry. But but Sherry, one thing I wanted to ask you is like, American identity is about the pursuit of happiness. So from your perspective, how should Americans go about finding their own happiness in their lives? Like what should be their strategy tactics? Because right now they're looking to the outside world, to the materialistic world. but you and I both know that there's a higher state of consciousness out there, which leads to more peace. But your perspective on that?
So my perspective is, first of all, what makes me happy will be very different to what makes the other person happy. So again, not a one size fits all approach. However, my broad advice would be to um, reflect and really think about what intrinsically makes you happy. So try, again, what makes me happy might be different than what makes you happy, right? But at least think about what are the internal sources of happiness beyond distractions. Because I think in America, you talk about pursuit of happiness. To me, America is like the land of distractions. It's like you can go your whole life never really thinking about what makes you happy. You're just pursuing distraction, one distraction to the other distraction to the other distraction to the other distraction.
I thought you said destruction. Oh, you mean distraction.
Distractions, so many distractions everywhere. And so, yeah, my advice is like turn off the noise, turn off all those distractions. If you think you like nice things and material things, that's fine. But think about it. Is that really what makes you happy? If that's great, fine, pursue those things. But
A lot of people think that makes them happy, but in reality, it doesn't. It's just temporary, right? So,
true. But really, it's like for some few people that might actually make them happy, which is fine. But it's like take the time to really reflect on like if I turn off all the noise, if I turn away all the distractions, like what is like intrinsically, motivating me, and that may change. It might be something today and something different next month or next year, but try to pay attention to that voice and then pursue that, right? Like, intentionally pursue that.
yeah, I mean, for sure. Like the ha intrinsic happiness is always better than extrinsic happiness. And when intrinsic means something that's internal, that's not based on on something that is attached to the outside. A lot of people need other people's validation, approval to be happy, or they are attached to material things. If they think they get the new iPhone or the new car, they'll be happy. But no, you can't go outside of yourself. You should find something that's internal, and then it's going to be more long lasting. So I agree with you on that, you know?
Yes.
So, Sherry, can you tell me and the audience a little bit more about the premise of your company, Enthea, and how it got started and what it's about?
Yeah, happy to. Really from everything I shared of like, poverty reduction to then trying to solve for mental health and then seeing the benefits of psychedelic therapy and wanting to get more people access. And then even I mentioned like, seeing that no one else is really offering these treatments at scale. Um, we have clinical trials, which is great. And we have these retreat centers, which I mentioned, which are also great, but that's only available for people who can afford to like fly to Jamaica and go to a retreat center, right? And so the premise of the company is to solve for this problem of safe and affordable access to mental health treatments that actually work. And bearing in mind that most Americans can't even afford like a $500 unexpected expense. And yet, you know, 1 in 2 Americans will experience a serious mental health issue in their lifetime. We have this problem of like we can't afford an out-of-pocket expense, but 1 in 2 of us are going to experience a mental health issue, and we don't have great ways to treat it, and the great ways that to treat it are very expensive. So my company tries to solve for all of this by channeling employer funding to mental health treatments that work through employee benefit plans. So the same way that you get dental and vision and medical benefits from your employer, you should be able to get benefits that work on your mental health. And in the end, not that it's all about this, but since it's America and it is like a capitalist society, in the end, this also helps the employer because it improves productivity and the absenteeism and the retention issues and all of that. So it's like a win-win for everyone. So that's kind of what my company does. And to make it clear, we create these plans so people can access ketamine therapy as a benefit.
That is amazing, Sherry. And I would definitely recommend anybody looking at this from the audience to definitely check this out. And Sherry, are there any projects that you're doing right now, other than this, that you'd want the audience to get a glimpse into?
Um, there are lots of projects, but this is my baby right now. So most of my focus and attention is on this. I consult to a university called the California Institute for Integral Studies that trains therapists so that they have many programs, but I work on the part that trains therapists on becoming psychedelic therapists. So if someone is interested in if someone is a therapist listening and wants to learn how to do this work, they could check that out. But honestly, most of my time is spent growing Anthea and getting more people access to these treatments.
That is amazing, Sherry. And Sherry, how can the audience connect with you and get to know more about you, your work, and everything that you do?
They can find me on LinkedIn, Sherry Race. I think there's only one of me on LinkedIn. And they can also email me at sherry@anthea.com. Yeah, those are the two ways to really reach me.
Sherry, I really appreciate that you took the time to come to this podcast and share your wisdom about mental health, psychedelic therapy, and its application to reducing poverty and work and improving workforce productivity. Because all of this is ultimately interconnected on a deep level, And I do hope that you take the time to come back to the show at a later time.
Thank you so much, Cosmos. This was so much fun.
I mean, it was fun as well. And I want to conclude this episode by letting my fellow extraordinary Americans know that, hey, look, there's an extraordinary with each and every one of us. It's our duty to awaken it and unleash it. Until next time, bye for now. Hey everyone, thank you for watching Extraordinary America. If you like what you see, please do subscribe to our podcast and share it with others. Remember that the best investment that you can make in your lifetime is in your own financial education, for it is knowledge that truly sets us free. Also, remember that inflation is diluting your purchasing power, which in turn increases financial bondage. The practical thing to do is to protect the loss of your purchasing power and invest in precious metals or the right cryptocurrencies. Lastly, never forget that you are an extraordinary American. We'll see you in the next episode. Bye for now.